Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Seefeng. Professor Jon Mills is an author of more than 30 books in philosophy, psychoanalysis, psychology, and cultural studies, among which would be this one, Psyche, Culture, World, Excursions in Existentialism and Psychoanalytic Philosophy, and his latest one, Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis from the Frankfurt School to Contemporary Critique. Now, welcome, Jon. We're looking forward to your talk on white supremacy and professionalism.
Well, I'm grateful for the invitation to speak. Critical social justice, or woke culture, starts with the premise that they want everyone to accept without having to think about its validity. In philosophy, we call this a non sequitur. You simply make a statement that is taken at face value to be true when you provide no arguments or justifications to support the conclusion that's already presupposed. Take, for example, the ubiquitously repeated phrase that we are dominated by, quote, white supremacy and structural racism that has suffused the systemic, institutional, and organizational life of all fabrics of society. To equate the motives and mindsets of supremacy over others to white people en masse is to assume that all whites actually hold these attitudes and beliefs when the majority of Caucasians would deny this attribution, as it's most insulting to their personal identities and offensive to their moral values. Since when can we just simply change the meaning of words that have historically, consensually, and socially accepted definitions we all understand and abide by? Being part of a social collective based on skin color doesn't remotely mean that people adopt such beliefs traditionally attributed to extremist white nationalist groups. It is manufactured social engineering based in false projective consciousness, wrongfully looking for some designated whipping boy to demonize and pillory. Exactly what do we mean when we say that white supremacy is responsible for systemic racism? What do we mean by the system? What system? Where is it? How is it constituted? Is it a hypostatization, abstraction, or merely a metaphor? Furthermore, since when does an abstract system, say all social and governmental institutions and private industries, acquire coordinated efforts and agency to enact these racist practices when all people participate in them? What exactly points to white supremacy in the system? What exactly defines or signifies racism in the system? What are its ordinal properties, dispositions, and modes of appearance? Where exactly is it in the system? Belaboring this, point out the constituents that comprise its structural ontology. Where are they located? Where do they actually come from in the system? Point me out the structural components and processes that underlie this so-called social reality. It seems like there is either a ghost in the machine that has put a magic spell on the masses, or people are either unconscious or willfully ignorant of their participation in such a sinister plot to keep others down, including themselves. And if oppressed minorities are part of the system, why would they contribute to their own racist suppression? Here we have become complacent in uncritically accepting this conspiratorial ideology that we complicitly allow to dominate the way we talk about things. When people are unwilling to challenge the white supremacy hypothesis that has been taken for granted, then we have become disloyal to reason and the argument for evidence, simply because it has become a politically dominant imposition by a minority vocal few based on an argument from desire, duping a gullible public that doesn't want to confront racial identity politics. As a philosopher and psychoanalyst, I'm not here to express platitudes about human nature, nor do I believe in the potential for a futuristic utopian anti-racist society. Prejudice and racism are no more likely to disappear than the reality of the external world. It merely becomes a question of the extent of amelioration we may achieve through our humanistic social commitments. We know that human beings by nature are inclined toward prejudice and racism toward others, as it's not the better angels of our nature, yet it simply is a matter of degree. I do not doubt for a moment that discrimination exists in certain pockets of society, largely instantiated through individual acts of prejudice that can become organized in various factions or micro orders that leak into larger enterprises or social collectives. We may witness these discriminatory practices today in housing markets, loaning institutions, redlining, police profiling, and incarceration rates, just to name a few. But this does not mean that every institution is systemically corrupt. We may speculate that when this occurs, it is largely governed by an unspoken set of attitudes tacitly operative in a local system that are designed to perpetuate certain values over others, even if they're governed by unconscious implicit bias. But these tendencies, rules, policies, regulations, and practices would not likely be formal aspects of administrative systems, such as written statutes, directives, or codes of conduct that are manualized or carried out as part of the dictates that run and sustain organizational governance and employee behavior, unless they are openly bigoted. And even if they are, this would only represent a small fraction of society. What I take objection to is the unsubstantiated claim that society is governed by white supremacy, especially when white supremacy is the alleged motive behind discriminatory and racist acts, as if white people want to dominate all others. The thesis that white supremacy underlies and governs the structures and systems of society is also an assertion that by nature is unfalsifiable. By violating the principle of falsifiability, this ensures that the premise is indestructible, as if it were sacrosanct dogma. Yet it's not. This proposition merely makes a claim that is taken to be true and requires others to accept as fact that no one can question without being accused of negating the very proposition that everyone is expected to take at face value. And if we don't, or challenge this thesis, using an old sophist cudgel, people are conveniently branded a racist. Despite the lack of arguments or evidence to support the conclusions that have already been magically bestowed empirical truth, the self-predication of the argument is not open to inquiry, skepticism, intellectual debate, or scientific investigation that relies on a falsification principle as the methodological refutation of conjectures. Why would we accept mere opinion as objective truth about social reality? A statement alone provides no justification that merits uncritical acceptance. A predicate is not proof of itself. Merely saying that something is the case does not make it so. You cannot define something into existence. The premise that white supremacy and systemic racism governs contemporary society is total nonsense based on lame sophistry. Professionalism is racist. In the context of speaking to a psychoanalytic audience, Shira Harrell makes the following provocative statement, quote, "Professionalism is by and large imbued with and promulgates white supremacist ideology," end quote. To justify this claim, she relies on Asha Gray, who states that professionalism is a, quote, coded language for white favoritism and workplace practices that more often than not privilege the values of white and Western employees and leave behind people of color, end quote. Gray, in turn, bases her assertions on Tima Ukun, who professes that traits and values such as perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness, worship of the written word, paternalism, power hoarding, and, I love this one, objectivity are based in white supremacy. When you have to read it. When these attitudes and values and psychological proclivities present themselves cross-culturally in all societies, as social scientists aptly tell us. This is propaganda, not scholarship. This twaddle is further parroted by Laura Shii, the president of Division 39 of the APA, who openly supports the terrorist organization Hamas and advocates for the destruction of Israel. Now, she boldly claims, quote, "The discourse of professionalism is also used as a civilizational technique to imperiously shame women and people of color, and is intentionally deployed as a disciplinary tactic to stabilize patriarchy and whiteness. Those in psychoanalysis, ironically, also willfully forget the sordid history our entire profession has had in silencing, pathologizing, and disciplining BIPOC women's bodies and minds," end quote. Given professional standards of discourse, decorum, expertise, competence, and conduct exist in all strata of society, from sewer treatment protocols to plumbing, paralegals, and parliament. Attributing qualified and specialized knowledge and skills to white patriarchy attempting to subjugate women and people of color is an ideological delusion fueled by identity politics. Such a crass dismissal of professionalism in professional psychology is a fine example of critical social justice proselytation espousing anti-white racism that is prevalent in contemporary psychoanalytic circles, and anti-Semitism, I might add. It is not true, neither empirically nor phenomenologically, that we live in a society that is governed in all of its professions by white supremacist ideology. These terms attribute extremist, hateful, nefarious racism that's traditionally accorded to fringe groups to all of society that are populated by peoples classified as white. Given that there is no such thing as whiteness, it does not exist or appear on the genome, how long will the public tolerate this bullshit? This is especially problematic given that Canada, the UK, and the United States have large multi-ethnic demographics. Some minority representations, but who in no way constitute a homogeneous voice, have adopted the the white superiority, oppressor, colonizer, do or done to narrative, juxtaposed to the inferior, oppressed, colonized, victimized discourse based on a dead historical past where British and European nations participated in imperial pursuits that have nothing to do with the actions of contemporary citizens. But somebody must pay the piper. Who's the bad guy here? Whitey, of course, a simple reduction to skin color. All the complexities of human identity devolve into this simplistic, naive story, itself a myth. And those who happen to fall in that skin color category, itself a manipulated social convention, are casually cast into the societal wastebasket as being a white supremacist. How can such generalizations be intellectually sustained, let alone empirically demonstrated? They can't. White people are not the same. Not all oppressed people are the same. And they do not necessarily belong to a minority group. They are everywhere. The real issue that is often minimized or overshadowed by other identity politics is that of inequality and disparities. The question, scope, and limits of equality and disparity are where the core issues lie, which correspond to class, economics, and education. And they'll continue to languish unless it becomes a leading public policy point. But let's not kid ourselves. Not everyone is equivalent, nor should we expect them to be. Merit is earned through labor, self-determination, and perhaps a bit of luck, even if chance favors the prepared mind or is the residue of design. This is why the use of racialized categories based on skin color only creates more of a wedge and reactionary defensiveness by many different disparate groups, not just whites. No one can speak for others, let alone a mass of peoples who have composite identities. People are diminished as human beings when they are reduced to the color of their skin, and that is why Martin Luther King famously pleaded society to judge others based on the integrity of their character. Attributing professionalism to white supremacy is not only a salient false claim, the premise is absurd. The meaning of the word professionalism has many different vectors of signification, not to mention that meaning is overdetermined. To generalize its meaning to signify one thing only, namely white dominancy, is a semantic reduction and a profane, incendiary provocation no reasonable person should take seriously. It is a form of false consciousness executed by false bravado with no substance, simply its own doctrine corrupting society, and dangerous at that. Let's unpack and critique this ideology a little further. How could all professional groups, organizations, and agencies be run by white supremacist ideology? By definition, this would extend to all professional organizations that are not governed by Caucasian people at the helm or in the corporate hierarchy. The premise is not only a philosophical embarrassment, it is utter nonsense. Just so readers, or just so participants here are not misled, here's what Gray says. Quote, the term white supremacy describes a series of characteristics that institutionalize whiteness and Westernness as both normal and superior to other ethnic, racial, and regional identities and customs. White people often don't view this theorization of white supremacy as violent. It can lead to systemic discrimination and physical violence. So let's break down the argument. We went from a conventional meaning of supremacist thinking, spewing forth from David Duke's vile mouth, to whiteness in general. The arbitrary white person is now given the compliment of thinking they are superior to others when they never claim to be. And that just because others say so, it is true a fortiori regardless. Don't we call that a projection? I simply cannot accept that North American or Britain is dominated, let alone run by white supremacy. Maybe a case could be made for this generalization in recent apartheid South Africa, but not in America, and certainly not in Canada, where the population distribution is a vast multicultural demographic, where Caucasians have been dwarfed by diverse immigration from the global majority and asylum seekers who have entered the workforce. Racism, yes, that exists everywhere, but supremacy, I don't accept that. There's a big difference. It is a category mistake to say that English culture is all based in extremist thinking. Even the APA, American Psychological Association, despite its wokeness, adopts a Rousseauian definition, quote, by which a profession keeps its social contract with society. The profession professes to the public that it will be altruistic, competent, self-regulating, trustworthy, and address societal concerns, end quote. The very proposition of attributing white supremacy to society, let alone professionalism, rather than in particular environments perpetrated by discrimination or bias in societal practices or the workforce, is itself a racist theory, prejudiced by the concept of color and otherness. Whiteness now becomes the emotional whipping post to beat just because others need to blame some scapegoat, a white sheep nonetheless. I'll spare you from the substantial body of works I have already engaged in my writings that address these concerns in more nuanced manners, but the fundamental notion that the symbolic white person reified to a thing or ordinal property, whiteness, who is to blame for everything wrong in society is an inflammatory act of racist rhetoric that only makes race relations and social justice initiatives worse. This rhetoric embraces an insidious splitting and condones that the bad object is based on skin color, which only ensures entrenched opposition by any party wanting to point the finger of denunciation as acceptable praxis. Carter exemplifies this trend in anti-white racism, cast without shame. He quotes, "If psychoanalysis cannot fully countenance its own investment in whiteness, it will die. Its most luminous insights are those that shed light on dynamics of abuse, hatred, shame, and persecution. These insights are more relevant to those of us with considerable personal experience with such things: people of color, queer people, poor people, disabled people, people at all kinds of margins, and those who come near the margins to love us. The whiteness of professional psychoanalysis is absolutely noxious to us. We might be the new lifeblood of this field if whiteness does not insist on segregating us out of the profession by being unsurvivably hostile to us," end quote. Now, Carter appears to be oblivious to his own racism under the sway of projective identification, where destructive envy is projected outwardly toward the persecutory white object, which he then unconsciously identifies with as a paranoid object of hate that he in turn reincorporates back into his internal structure as being the object of oppression and victimhood, while all along he is sadistically whipping the boy. The argument toward the divestment of whiteness further hinges on a racist fundamentalism or fanaticism attributed to all white people based on circular logic and ethnocentric inversion. Although I have no problem with ethnocentrism, as value practices and self-advocacy for ethnic, racial, and regional identities and customs are a legitimate form of moral and social justice discourse, I must object when such ethnocentrism radicalizes and nullifies alterity based on the color of their skin. When this occurs, we lapse into inverted racist condemnation of the other for simply being different. The premise that professionalism is based in white supremacy is incoherent at best and delusional at worst, which is not even remotely considered by the sciences or humanities to hold any weight. The proposition is itself a philosophical mortification and a veneer to sow woke identity politics. Since when do people like the Proud Boys run corporate capitalism, government, and public institutions that regulate professional bodies like psychology and psychotherapy, and the actions of their members? Do all professional bodies that serve the public, such as municipal government, medicine, healthcare, science, education, financial institutions, civic engineering, actuarial science, and so forth, operate on extremist white ideology? How about STEM education? Is the field of mathematics run by a bunch of white supremacists? Of course not, especially given that mathematics was founded by non-white cultures in ancient times. These professions are composed of many people from diverse class, race, ethnic, cultural, and gender distributions that negate such propaganda prima facie, not to mention the phenomenal quality of people's lived experience. In other words,
John.
Yeah, I'm almost done. In other words, they experience, feel, and live otherwise. That simplistic assertion attributed to all white people. If this version of social reality is correct, that would mean every person in society participates, supports, and is complicit in this white supremacist institutional conspiracy system. But they don't. Look at society. A whole system cannot be supremacist unless it's totalitarian. That is not our liberal social democracy. Contemporary North America and UK societies are not as remotely racist as white supremacy conspiracy theory promotes, for it would cease to be democratic. World societies are quite diverse, not the homogeneity racial identity politics proclaim them to be. An othering perspective of white life does not need to negate otherness, just as otherness need not negate difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much.